I have to say with poetry, a lot of people can write it. I mean, they might not be very good, but not everybody can understand it. I'm not talking about the easy stuff like,
two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both.
I'm talking about poetry like,
around the idea of thee the war revolving, with all its angry and vehement play of causes.
Like, what? What does that mean? I felt like poetry was one big secret that the whole literary world knew, but I had never been let in on. I mean, those poets with their knowing looks and little beatnik outfits, what are they really up to? And people saying, oh yeah, this poem is good. It really speaks to me. And like, how do you tell if a poem is good? If it doesn't make sense? I mean, if that's the case, I could write poetry too. Cataclysmic banana slugs, Stratford upon Avon, from which he hails. Table, table, suddenly able. Mabel, carpet stains that never go away. Telephone line. See? And that could have spoken to someone. That could have been good. If only you understood it. So this brings me back to my junior summer in high school, when I went on my quest to understand poetry. I was at the Iowa Young Writers Studio in Iowa City, one of the most vibrant and literary cities in America. Famous writer groups had formed here once, and quotes from books decorated the sidewalk paths. It was like actors in L.A. Just about everyone in Iowa City had a half-written novel stashed away in a drawer somewhere. The Writers' Studio was a 2-week creative writing program in which I would be surrounded by some of the best writers and poets out there. I mean, I figured if I couldn't unlock the key to poetry here, I'd be forever screwed anywhere else. So during the first few days of the studio, I went to my first poetry reading. I forget what the poet's name was. She wasn't famous. Well, there really aren't any famous poets nowadays, but she was reading from her published anthology of her works, which meant some editor at some publishing house somewhere had thought her poems were good. And now I was going to listen to the actual poet actually reading her work in front of me. The quiet lady on stage cleared her throat. She was wearing red librarian glasses and was holding a thin book out in front of her. I sat up, paying close attention. I was convinced that somehow she would transmit her poet wisdom to the audience that would magically elicit sudden and deep understanding for us all. I was very hopeful. This one's called Colosseum, she said, and she began to read.
Later by just an hour than death.
Something was wrong.
Yesterday.
No such understanding came.
She have guessed that it
I mean,
be,
I understood all the
but
words
a
and
crier of
phrases.
the glee have
She had
climbed
read them
the distant
slowly
hill,
and deliberately enough,
had not
but
lived
somehow,
so slow a pace.
everything just streamed
Who
by over
knows
my
that
head.
this surrendered face
I
were
furiously
undefeated
focused
still.
and concentrated and hung onto
Oh,
the
if there may
images,
departing
trying to make
be
sense of the
any
metaphors,
forgot by victory
word
in
choice,
her
and figure out the
imperial
meaning.
round.
But nothing.
Show them this meek apparelled
Nothing.
thing that could not
The poem
stop to
faded
be a
away
king,
as I mentally scrambled
doubtful
after
if
the
it be
pieces.
crowned.
It was like listening to a foreign language, completely incomprehensible. I slumped back into my chair, overwhelmed and disappointed. But still, I didn't give up. I was on a quest. So I went to as many poetry readings as possible, flipped through an array of poetry anthologies, and read my fellow writers' works, on the search and hope for understanding. But after a week, again, nothing. I just couldn't understand poetry. So one afternoon, in frustration, I accosted Adam Fell, one of the poetry instructors at the studio, about what poetry actually was. Adam wasn't the usual poet. He was young, blonde, athletic, good-looking. You know, the laid-back, sandal-wearing Jack Johnson type. So anyway, we were sitting outside on the steps of the staircase, chatting one afternoon, when I blurted, in the middle of the conversation, "What exactly is poetry? It doesn't make sense." Adam looked at me in that good-naturedly way of his, and he smiled.
It's whatever you want it to be,
he said.
It doesn't have to make sense.
Wow, I see. I really get it now, I said. Gee, thanks. I'm just kidding. That didn't help at all, and that's not what I actually said. What I actually said was, what? And then he explained to me, poetry didn't actually have to have a meaning.
Poetry sometimes is about the rhythm, feeling, imagery, and how the words sound together. You're overthinking it,
he said. Right. I was overthinking it. By this time in the story, I'd given up the struggle. Who needs to understand poetry anyway? It's not like I actually read a lot of it. I liked fiction better. But then something happened that would change my view on poetry forever. The 2 weeks had passed, and the writer's studio was over. That last day, we held a closing ceremony in which the faculty read us their works. All of the faculty had MFAs, or Masters of Fine Arts, in creative writing, and they were all very, very good. I remember sitting in a dark auditorium facing the stage. A single spotlight cast a large orb of light onto the microphone. One by one, the faculty read their works. They were funny, emotional, well-crafted. I can't remember much of any of them now. And then it was Adam's turn. I watched him walk leisurely on stage. He took a few folded sheets of paper from out of his pocket and shook them open. He was, of course, reading a poem, he announced. He gave a little smile at the audience, and then he read the poem that I wouldn't forget for the rest of the summer. It's funny, looking back, that Adam's poem affected me the way it did, because I hadn't understood that poem either. I didn't understand what the lines meant. I didn't understand why they were in the order in which they were. I didn't catch the meaning of what the man and the woman were saying to each other, or why he chose the images he did. But surprisingly, none of that mattered, because I had felt it. It was clarity. The words were like sunlight, and my mind absorbed them naturally like a plant. And then I felt like an idiot for all the times I tried to analyze and understand. Adam was right. I was overthinking it. Poetry wasn't a why, or a how, or a what. It just was. Some poems will resonate with you. Most of them won't. I had struggled so hard to understand and look for answers that I simply forgot to appreciate. I think we all do a lot of that in life sometimes. Struggle and work, and forget to just relax and appreciate things as they are. Of course, I was a hypocrite, because it wasn't until 2 years later that I actually learned that lesson. But for right then, in that dark room, I just closed my eyes and let the words resonate. Adam's voice gently washed over the crowd. This was poetry. I basked in its rhythm.